A while back I made a video on the He for She campaign, and made some critique of that and Emma Watson's speech. I want to comment a little bit further on it because I've come across various blogs and videos and so on since then, and there's a few other points I'd like to touch on. I stand by my position that I think the campaign and the speech is very flawed. Firstly, let's work on the basic premise of this campaign, or the supposed premise. He for she. Now, Emma Watson said the concept of this is trying to make the feminist movement inclusive. It is a feminist agenda, there's no escaping from that fact, because Emma Watson herself made that clear in her speech, that she regards herself as a feminist and that she doesn't want the term to be, or she's tired of the term having negative connotations, so she wants it to be more inclusive. So let's just be clear from the outset, it is a feminist campaign. Some people are sort of suggesting that just because she's describing herself that way doesn't mean it's a feminist campaign. It blatantly is a feminist campaign. But let's look at the premise, he for she. The idea is that men, she's saying that men can be included in the movement by essentially serving women, standing up for women's rights. Now, that automatically puts an unequal situation out there. Okay, this is not people standing up for people. I'm sure I mentioned this in previous videos, but I do think the issues are important because they're constantly brought up in the media. It's not about people for people. It's about he for she. Now, I mentioned perhaps in a previous video that we shouldn't be too pedantic about the wording, but actually I'll retract on that. I think it is quite important. It is important to be pedantic because this is a campaign that has got a lot of support, and whilst I think the premise in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, it is still misleading because it is part of the feminist movement, and I think the feminist movement is very divisive. Now, like I said in the first video I made about this, Emma Watson's speech itself is relatively moderate, and you can tell that at some point she's trying to strike a balance and she's trying to reach out to men by acknowledging that there are issues that impact men. But she doesn't go anywhere near enough to address decades of feminist hypocrisy, division and misandry. She sort of begrudges the fact that feminism has a bad image, but it's not going to take one speech to overcome the problems that feminism has brought on itself. Now, for one thing, there is a notable thing to consider. The patriarchy is clearly so awful and oppressive that it lets Emma Watson speak at the UN and get rousing applause. The patriarchy is clearly so awful and women are clearly so oppressed that you cannot go by a day without leading media outlets like the BBC, like Time Magazine, like CNN, have at least one news item or article connected with feminism. Just check it out. Go onto Facebook and subscribe to any of those networks and you'll see what I mean. There isn't a day goes by when they don't have some report about how terrible patriarchy is and something about women's rights. Now, just to be clear, I've never at any point had a problem with women's issues being reported. I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a problem with is those things being reported completely to the disregard of men's issues. So, for example, earlier the BBC had an article about sexism. Okay, no problem. Guess what? They only focused on women. I made some objections to that and my comments got removed. And I wasn't trolling, these weren't hateful objections, they were strongly worded, but they were not attacking any individual. I was simply pointing out the hypocrisy of their report, because they were talking about sexism and only focusing on women. Now, he for she is based on the general feminist argument that men are princes of privilege and women are downtrodden. This is a damaging and very misleading claim, because for one thing, there are many, many, many men in the world who are downtrodden. Now you could argue that there are religious aspects and cultural aspects that do put down women, and I would buy that because there is many examples of it. But in many totalitarian states, men are persecuted as well. For example, and not just in totalitarian states, in developing countries. For example, feminists often begrudge the fact that women don't have, and girls don't have access to education. Now that is a problem. Of course it's a problem. But in many developing countries, young boys don't have access to education either, because you have problems like child labour. In a country like Mauritania, child labour is a huge problem, and that affects all children. So I'm sick and tired of the feminist movement insinuating that it is only females that suffer. And that's basically what it does. It sends out the message that all men are princes of privilege and all women are downtrodden. This is a very dangerous claim, because a woman CEO has a hell of a lot more power and privilege than the 75% of homeless people who are male. So why is it that issue is never brought up? Now, to be fair, Emma Watson does raise some of these issues in her speech, but what I get the impression from that speech is basically the feminist movement knows full well it's getting a negative image, and I'm not sure if it's such a coincidence that this has come slightly only a few months after Women Against Feminism started up. I'm not sure that is a coincidence. I think the feminist movement knows that it has bad PR. I think they know that most men and most women don't subscribe to it. Therefore, they basically need a bit of PR. It's a bit like a political party that has fallen on hard times and needs some positive spin on things. So to me, all he for she is a stunt, one giant stunt, to try and change feminism's image. If it was really about equality, it would be people for people, and if it was really inclusive, it would be saying, look, okay, let's invite men to help sort out issues that impact women, but meanwhile women are also going to help out issues that impact men. There's been no such campaign of that sort. Feminists couldn't care less about male suffering, because if they did, they would be having specific campaigns about men's issues, and they just don't care. You know, Emma Watson may have acknowledged it, but until she actually puts some action to that, or until other feminists do, then I don't believe that feminism really is about equality, and I'm sick and tired of feminists claiming that it is. Because rhetoric counts for nothing unless you prove it with action. And feminism is a deeply divisive ideology. I mean, in the end of the day, it is feminism, right? It's not humanism. It's not the equilibrium movement. It is feminism. By nature, it is a gender-centric movement. And instead of constantly focusing on trying to get women to the top, a position that most people will never occupy, they completely disregard men at the bottom. I mean, I keep mentioning the homeless issue because I think it is a significant issue. Homelessness must be one of the worst positions to be in. 75% of the homeless are male. That issue is never brought up. Why not? Now, just for the record, homelessness is bad for anyone. And I'm not saying there aren't women who are homeless as well, there are. It's a terrible situation for anyone. But if it was a reverse situation, say that for the sake of argument, say that 75% of the homeless were women, it would be a massive, massive news item. It wouldn't be out of the newspapers. It would be spoken about all the time. But because it's men, hey, it doesn't matter so much. I feel very strongly that men's issues are massively overlooked. And I've made critique of the masculist movement. I believe some of their rhetoric is just as problematic as the feminist movement. So I still don't believe that masculism is the answer. Rather, I just want to see an equal footing in terms of how these issues are covered. I'm not against men's rights or masculism. I just think that as a counter movement, it's starting to be just as polarizing as feminism. But some masculists put off sympathetic women. in the same way that a lot of feminists would put off sympathetic men. Just for the record, by the way, I've seen a lot of male feminists come out to defend this campaign. The issue I take with male feminists, and I find a lot of them very smug and very arrogant, is they basically go out of their way to martyrise women and don't acknowledge actually that women are human beings and equally capable of faults. So they turn women into angels and they slander their fellow men, and I'm sick of them, basically. These guys, if they really are interested in equality, maybe some are, but there are extreme male feminists who, I get the impression, just hate their own gender. I mean, there's one point in Emma Watson's speech where she says, let's give men the opportunity to be human too. Something along those lines, basically. And when you look deeper into the speech, there are definitely some points that raise question marks about what the real intention of this is. Now, I don't think Emma Watson's a bad person. She's a young woman, and I think she probably has good intentions. But that speech does not change my mind about feminism at all, and it certainly doesn't make me rush to sign up to he for she. Does that mean that I'm callous and not uncaring about women's issues? Of course not. There are women's issues in the world, as I tried to point out in my video about misogyny, and I wanted to cover other issues as well. There are issues that impact women in the world. There is. And I think men do need to acknowledge that, and decent men should care about those issues. But he for she is completely misguided, because it lends to the feminist distortion that all men are privileged and all women are downtrodden. You know, it's all about including men, so I guess it's got a more inclusive overtone, but it is still in the context of basically serving women. So it's not really about equality at all. And it's also patronising because a lot of men already care about women's rights. I still maintain that whilst there are misogynists out there, if you ask an average man on the street, for example, what he thinks of rape or what he thinks of violence against women, most of them would have answers like, oh yeah, that's terrible. Feminism goes on the assumption that most men are inherently sexist. Feminism goes on the assumption, no, the insinuation, that most men are privileged. These are the sort of dangerous distortions that turn men against women and women against men. It is by nature a divisive movement, and no feminist actions really show me otherwise. That's not the same as saying all feminists hate men, because I don't believe they do. That's a bit of a stereotype, and I don't think it's the case. You know, I've been in debates with feminists where they say, oh, we're mothers, we're sisters, we're wives, we don't hate the men in our lives. Okay, maybe you don't hate the men in your lives, but the feminist movement, by nature, is still a movement that is not really about equality at all. If it was about equality, it wouldn't be a gender-centric movement. It would be a truly egalitarian movement. It's not. And this is the only bargaining chip the feminist movement really has, because it knows, and I'm saying it as a collective abstract thing, this doesn't have any single leader, and I do accept that there are different levels of feminists. There's radical feminists, there's third wave feminists, etc, etc. But for the sake of this video, I'm talking in generic terms. Feminism is a polarizing movement, because it teaches women to constantly believe that they are victims, and teaches men to constantly believe that they are oppressors. And like I said, I really take issue with this male privilege claim. I think that is a deep insult to the millions, literally millions of men who have died in war, or maimed in war, who have died in industrial accidents, that women did not have to do anywhere near the same, on the same scale. So what I would like to say is, by all means, support women's rights. That's important. And I do believe in women's rights. I do. I'm not a hardcore masculist. I do believe there are legitimate women's issues out there. I just believe he for she represents everything that's wrong with the feminist movement. It is by nature divisive. It is by nature gender-centric. And it is really not what it claims to be. I've yet to see evidence of that. I just believe it is a big PR stunt by the feminist movement to try and change their image, and it ain't going to work with me. I'll continue supporting general human rights. I'll sign petitions for specific women's issues, specific men's issues, and especially human rights.